Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, Beth Dunlop, and Teófilo Victoria to discuss the newest edition of The Classicist, an annual journal from the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art dedicated to the classical tradition in architecture and the allied arts. Focused on Florida, The Classicist No. 17 explores the city's rich architectural history, as well as contemporary examples of classical design through professional and student portfolios, as well as academic articles authored by leaders within the field. Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk is a founding principal of DPZ Co-Design and Malcolm Matheson Distinguished Professor of Architecture at the University of Miami, where she directs the Master in Urban Design program. Her practice ranges from building and community designs to zoning codes. She teaches university courses in architecture, urban design, and adaptation to climate change. She's a co-founder of the Congress for the New Urbanism and has served on the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. Beth Dunlop is an Alicia Patterson Fellow writing about the environmental, cultural, and architectural consequences of overbuilding. Her newest book, Addison Meisner, Architect of Fantasy and Romance, is the 29th book on architecture and design that she's either written or co-written. She was a Pulitzer-nominated architecture critic for the Miami Herald for more than 2 decades. Teófilo Victoria holds a Master's of Architecture and Urban Design degree from Columbia University, a Bachelor's of Fine Arts and a Bachelor's of Architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design. He has been visiting professor at Harvard University and Cornell University and has lectured and participated in juries at the University of Maryland, Notre Dame University, and the Instituto Universitario de Arquitectura in Venice. We'll have some time to take audience questions after the presentation, so please post your questions anytime during the broadcast by using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and Graham Jones will join us to moderate the Q&A with the audience. Graham is an urban planner at DPZ Co-Design and passionate about innovative ways of working. Before joining DPZ and relocating to the US, Graham held the high-profile position of Scotland's Assistant Chief Planner. I'll also take a moment to remind you that you can order your copy of The Classicist No. 17 from Books and Books below by pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen, and every purchase you make keeps Books and Books up and running, and we thank you for your generous donations too. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hi, Liz.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, Beth.
Hi.
Hi, Teófilo.
Good evening.
All right, we're trying to share. Nope. We'll try again. Sorry for the pause. It says we are screen sharing.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Good evening, everyone. I need to start out with copious thank yous for all the people who made this evening possible. Certainly, thank you, Christina Nosti and Books and Books. There are a host of characters who brought us to this point, including Irina Waffle and most recently, Chen Nguyen from my firm, who made sure the computing aspects of this would work. And we're, I think all of us, very pleased to be able to share this publication with you all, but also to be able to talk about it. It was, I think you'll see, a labor of love on the part of many people, and maybe we'll show you some aspects of Florida that either you've never seen collected quite in this way, or maybe even thought of exist in our state. So the three of us look forward to sharing both general and deeper ideas about it with you. I should say, in terms of the publication itself, Stephen Brooks' photographs have made us all look good and make the state look very good. Stephanie Salomon was the managing editor. I was the guest editor, and my assistant Shannon Tracy managed us all very effectively, even up to the last minute. So what is The Classicist? This is a publication that comes out every year, published by the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, based and originally founded in New York, but now with chapters around the country, including Florida chapter. And here you see some of the prior issues in which The Classicist focused on particular places, largely cities or regions, and we were the first to undertake a state, which you can imagine was a challenge. Now, I'm showing you the table of contents because to entice you into exploring this further on your own. You might notice that there's only a very few pages in each section. It's eminently readable. It's full of beautiful photographs and drawings, and you never have to spend too much time with it in the very contemporary manner that we're all accustomed to, short attention span. So I'm also going to zigzag a little bit through that table of contents and spend a little bit of time from the work that I did as guest editor and covering the ground that was covered in essays by the people who are not with us this evening. There is in the book, as it says here, a brief history, which attempts to, in very short order, round up this topic across the whole state. No small challenge. And of course, our own city, Coral Gables, is a very important part of that. I don't know if you know, for instance, that our city hall was in fact inspired by an 1834 classical building in Philadelphia called the Bourse, designed by well-known William Strickland, well-known Philadelphia architect in the early years of our country. And it's a good example of classicism in South Florida. The essay will take you through the beginnings of classicism in Florida. One of the early buildings, Carrera and Hastings Flagler residence in Palm Beach, moves on to the evolution of how that style or that type of architecture moved on to a more vernacular form. A decade and a half later already, William Deering's Vizcaya was already an exemplar of the Mediterranean style. It covers a lot of ground in between those two and all around the state, and then proceeds to point out to you that not only were there individual buildings of interest, but we, unlike many other states, have a 20th century history of new community building. So when we look at the new communities of New England, for instance, we might be thinking largely of the early American settlements, but we have 20th century settlements from Coral Gables to Palm Beach, even the development of Jacksonville, for instance. And so I try to bring that history up to date with some of the more recent community building, including Seaside and, of course, Celebration. So meanwhile, while there might have been some years of not a lot of classical building, the universities, and in particular the University of Miami, were, in a sense, the monasteries preserving knowledge of that history and advancing it, and really pushing us into experimenting or carrying on the traditions in contemporary practice. And so this issue of the classicist takes you through that history and completes it with the contemporary practice that Teófilo will tell us about towards the end. And so it's only fitting that a recent addition to our School of Architecture was one designed by Leon Krier, who is a contemporary classicist, who has very much promoted our knowledge of classicism in the past and today. And then one might look at the larger context, the city of Coral Gables, which renewed its commitment to traditional styles after many years of building mid-century ranch houses, let's say. And as the city grows, we begin to see that commitment to classicism and the Mediterranean in the large buildings of our time, the region developing and densifying on the high ground, so to speak. Many people don't like the scale of these buildings, but I think that we are quite outstanding nationally in terms of the scale of contemporary traditional practice. We have many exemplars to look to. And so there is as well a portfolio, a photo essay of fabulous buildings around the state. These are largely focused on South Florida because indeed there is, let's say, a lack or yet the opportunity to develop, to document and develop the knowledge of these buildings. Some of us know who some of them were designed by, but we don't have a good history of Southern Florida architecture in the manner or monographs on many of these architects in the manner that you will see me describing in other parts of the state. So here we have Miami Beach, downtown Miami, and really an outstanding building, our old post office by Keenel and Elliott, who were among the best. Two of the ICAA stalwarts, Michael Mesko and William Rutledge, put this essay together with a little bit of help from me. And there were just a few buildings that I insisted on because I thought they were really quite remarkable, like our U.S. courthouse, rather late in that trajectory, 1933, but full of incredible details in the kind of porous local stone, which you wouldn't see anywhere else in the United States. And of course, a beautiful courtyard, probably inspired by Vizcaya as well as older models. Coral Gables, which has, of course, the villages are well known. I don't have all of them here, but more importantly, the kind of civic program of the buildings of shared spaces and places that give us our identity and make a great focus, as there was at this period of Newtown building in the progressive era, on the public spaces. The open front lawns of Coral Gables are often larger than the rear yards, the private spaces, which is very much telling of that time. Palm Beach as well, of course, and Palm Beach continued to carry on the traditions. John Volk on the lower right-hand side was someone who continued and kept the flame alive, so to speak. But the church by Horace Trombauer in 28 is an excellent example. And once again, you see this kind of conversation between the classical and the Mediterranean. Now, among my favorites in putting all this together was the open air post office in St. Petersburg. And there's a wonderful story about how the postmaster delayed the building of the city's post office until he could convince his federal bosses that the post boxes should, in fact, be on this exterior corridor. So you would come in to pick up your mail in a post box in that exterior space. And they were very much aware of the climate. And of course, this was before air conditioning. But also there was a great attention to detail and the detail of the region in some way, translating these traditions, the classical column capital with the figural pieces of a seafront city. And then, so that was the folio. There's only the captions that asks for further work in those, with those architects in those buildings. But the classicist does spend a little bit of time in St. Augustine, courtesy of Dr. Keyes. Leslie did a lovely article on Correr and Hastings in St. Augustine, well known, developing their practice here with Flagler, Henry Flagler, and then moving on to do fabulous buildings like the New York Public Library. And what you will see here is actually some experiments in the new technology of that time. Poured concrete with terracotta trim. You'll see a little bit more of that in a few minutes. Fabulous interiors. These are really outstanding. And more examples in which you can actually see the board form concrete, the kind of early, almost early modern honesty. Look at the dates though, the 1880s, and then the highly decorative terracotta components. One of the firm was named Bernard Maybeck, later going on to California, where he has much celebrated work in the San Francisco area. Bruce Stevenson, one of our favorite historians in the state, writes about his own home, Winter Park and Rollins College, speaking of the American Renaissance, also in the late 1800s, and the kind of idealism behind it. Again, you see Keenel and Eliot here, and Ralph Cram, who also was working around the United States. And as you delve into these places, you find a tremendous amount of, in some cases, fantasy, in other cases, idealism, but always great ambition to produce not only the buildings, but the places. And Rollins, like many universities these days, are looking back to their roots in order to maintain their identity, establish their image. And so this is a more recent building by a Miami firm, Chal Cooper. In Jacksonville, at the same time, at the end of the last century, a little bit later than the prior two, John Clutho started a practice. Jacksonville had a huge fire, and so there was a lot of rebuilding after that in the early 1900s. And he often made buildings that had copper roofs, probably in response to that, the preceding fires. And so these are beautiful stone and marble classical buildings with copper roofs and detailing. This one, unfortunately, the City Hall demolished. And Clutho's also a very good example of the trajectory, the longer trajectory of classicism, as it led the architects to examine the contemporary work of people like Frank Lloyd Wright, who influenced a whole portfolio of Clutho's work in the early 1900s, and eventually led him to Art Deco. Here it is, 1929, in Palatka. And I think from this, you can even see how the Miami Beach Art Deco has similar roots in classicism, symmetry, massing, and so on. So after this, of course, there was a big hiatus. The Depression, the World Wars, modernism taking a strong hold. And it really wasn't until a new generation, skipping several generations, a new generation of young architects started looking back. Postmodernist architecture assisted in that research. And there are a few pages on the work of Charles Barrett, who is no longer with us, but was a self-taught classicist. After his education at Yale, he started working on classicism, and with great skill, being able to wield these designs, not only in individual buildings, such as the gateway to Johnson and Wales in Providence on the right, which was in fact built, and it's in one of those sketches in the middle, but also as an understanding of how buildings can assemble in urbanism to make beautiful places. And so, Charles was of the same generation as the founders of the ICAA. There really was a kind of group of young people at that point, postmodern, looking to our traditional roots, and in particular, classicism. Now, these days, and the academic portfolio will show you, there is a good amount of instruction, of education at the university level, which is now focusing on classicism. I think there are many people who think there's not enough of this, and there's still a great bias against tradition and classicism in teaching, but we are, in fact, we have a growing number of institutions which do, to some degree, teach students about classicism. This first drawing was from, I need to look at my notes, from the Kingston School of Art in London. This is a project from Notre Dame, which is perhaps the University of Notre Dame, perhaps our best known school, totally committed to classicism. The Savannah College of Art on the left, and of course our own University of Miami students who, with faculty, who continue this aspect of education within a larger curriculum. But what students always need, and especially students of traditional architecture and classicism, is the inspiration of their great predecessors. And so we're very happy to have Beth with us to take a deep dive into the work of one of our local favorites, Addison Meisner. Beth?
Thank you, Liz. That was a trip down memory lane for me, and I'll explain why in just a second. But I wanted to mention that Thomas Hastings of Career and Hastings had grown up in Florida, which is extremely unusual because I think he was born in, I'm going to take a guess, 1830 something. But he was from a town named after his family called Hastings, that was the potato capital of Florida at the time. And I think it's quite remarkable that he ended up linking up with Carrera and forming one of the most distinguished architecture firms at the time. But they became a firm to design the buildings in St. Augustine. And anyway, that's just a little trivia. I joined the Herald in 1976, and in 1979, I was named the Herald's first and, to this date, only official architecture critic. Other people have written about architecture, but not with the title. And I went on to do so through 2013. The last building I reviewed was Pam, and then I just had too much else on my plate. But I think the expectations when the Herald named an architecture critic were that I would write about the flashy new buildings that were starting to emerge on the skyline. It was just at that point when new buildings were coming to Brickell. Brickell was being transformed into a business center, and downtown Miami was getting its first new building, then its second new building, which was the Government Center by Hugh Stubbins, which my son once referred to as a giant pencil. He was about 3 at the time. But I had a different agenda because I had already spent quite a bit of time in Florida walking around and driving around Coral Gables and Palm Beach and the Art Deco district, and going to Key West and going to St. Petersburg. And also, I might note that my coming of age as an architecture critic coincides almost entirely with the trajectory of DPZ, which can tell you plenty about what was going on in the minds of people who were thinking about and writing and being serious about architecture at the time. But a few years into my tenure as an architecture critic, I started thinking about the rest of Florida, and I had an idea, and I went to my editors and said, I want to write about all of Florida's endangered architecture. And it was long enough ago, I think it was 85 when I first proposed this, that, I mean, it seems like it was prehistoric times. There was no internet. So what did I do? I went to the library, to the wonderful Florida room, which now I fear for us all because I never use it. And there's something to be said for going down the row of books in the 879.6 or whatever it is. But I had to find out about Florida by reading travelogues from the 19th century and memoirs from the early 20th century, and then using the invaluable, ever wonderful WPA Guide to Florida as a way to find out what buildings we didn't know about. And there were a lot of them. And tragically, I haven't had the heart to go back through and count, but I do know that a number of them we've since lost in Pensacola and Ormond Beach. And but all of that cemented my interest in historic Florida architecture. And by the way, I did, I write about Clouseau and Nolan and Keenel, who I think is intriguingly, Keenel came to Miami as Pittsburgh's foremost practitioner of the Prairie School of Architecture. And if you look at original pictures of Miami High School from a distance, you can see there's something in the form that evokes that Prairie style. But anyway, it cemented my interest in really going farther and going deeper into the historic architecture of Florida. And it's caused me to write a number of books on Miami and Florida architecture, some with co-author Joanna Lombard and others on my own, such as I'm moving and packing up, and frustratingly, not all my books are here all of a sudden because I had help, and which is always good, but sometimes you miss to find out that things aren't where they should be. At any rate, most recently, I wrote a book about Addison Meisner, which is why I'm here today. And when I start a project, an essay or a book or whatever it is, I always, on the first page, I type at the top of the page, this is my little superstition that I'm sharing, what is the big idea? And then as I think about it, I write keywords down. And as I cover those topics, I delete the keywords. But I always try to think, what is it that we're going to take away from this? And I think rather than rehashing Meisner's life, I'm going to talk about briefly about what I think is important to think about when you think about Addison Meisner, and whose name is so synonymous with Palm Beach that it's almost an architectural buzzword. And for a long time, I think he was dismissed as being little more than a gadabout and a society architect, but nothing could be further from the truth. He was a serious student of both the art and craft of building, and he had an encyclopedic knowledge of historic architecture. And what we've been able to learn in the last few years is, in part because of the digitization of many newspapers across the land, there's a website which is really more of an archive of world history at this point, that has millions and millions of newspaper articles that were previously unavailable if they didn't get clipped by an archivist in a historical society. But also, Meisner was a scrapbooker before little ladies were making scrapbooks, and he read everything and he clipped everything, and he had a particular interest in European architecture and antiquity. And if you look at the scrapbooks, some of which they're off the Society of the Four Arts, and some of them are digitized, not all of them yet, I think. But you see that he was interested in cities, streets, buildings, facades, colonnades, stairways, columns, brackets, and everything right down to the andirons that were used in front of a fireplace. And he was really a fine and extremely knowledgeable historian, which kind of sometimes gets lost in the translation. And it gets lost because he also was the person who, with a single building, the Everglades Club, completed in 1919. By the way, I'm letting Liz just forward the photographs because I'm not speaking. There's the Everglades Club. But no, that's not the Everglades.
That's across the street.
Across the street. he transformed Palm Beach from being a town that some rich Midwesterners sometimes went to into an architectural and social symbol of wealth and exclusivity. His clientele included the Vanderbilts, the Stotesburys, the Dodges, the Wanamakers, the Phippses, the Rasmussens, many, many, many more. And what is interesting about this is that he was designing for a kind of self-anointed aristocracy, people whose pedigree was not centuries old, but just decades old. And he was giving them this patina of age-old aristocracy and an instant history in the buildings he designed. And I think that's important to know and to think about, because when you think about America, which is compared to much of the rest of the world, is still a young country, he was creating a place that let Americans feel like they were French dukes or Italian counts, and could live that way. And it transformed Palm Beach, but I think it also transformed the whole idea of class in America in a lot of ways. His methodology is pretty fascinating, and I wrote down. Forgive me for having notes, but I'm trying to compress a several hundred-word book into 10 minutes and not making it, I'm sure. But his methodology was to go back to those scrapbooks, basically, go back to his knowledge, and to design houses and buildings that looked like they'd evolved over time. We now call the architecture Mediterranean, but that, in fact, the name Mediterranean for architecture is a product of the 20th century. And one time, the late Arva Parks called me up and just out of the blue, she didn't even say hello. She said, "Why do we call it Mediterranean Revival? What were they reviving?" And she said, "I think from here going forward, we do not use the word revival when we use the word Mediterranean." And I never did again, because she was right. At any rate, this is what Meisner said about his work. "I sometimes start a house with a Romanesque corner, pretend that it has fallen into a disrepair and has been added to in the Gothic spirit, when suddenly the great wealth of the New World has poured in and the owner has added a very rich Renaissance addition." I love architecture that has a narrative myself, and I think that's just such a wonderful comment about his process. And he went on many, many buying trips. Americans in the early 20th century were essentially plundering Europe, which had gone from having an aristocracy and a working class, I guess you could call it these days, to having a middle class. And so there was a lot to plunder, and you'll see it in Vizcaya, you'll see it in all of the great houses of the early 20th century in America. But he went a step further, because what he couldn't fill in, he created himself, and he established, which was once Palm Beach County's biggest employer, Meisner Industries, to create everything: wrought iron, pottery, tile, balustrades, furniture. I actually have, by the sheerest luck, a piece of Meisner furniture. And my friend who was here from North Carolina kept looking at it. She's saying, "How did it get so old looking?" And I said, "Well, they basically sunk the pieces of wood in salt water so that it looked like it was worm riddled over the ages. But he aged things, and then he put everything together in this brilliant fashion, the aesthetic history and the invented history, all as a seamless whole that worked some magic."
Thank you, Beth. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful run through.
One more thing.
Yes.
I just want to say that I think his most important achievement, though, for all of that is Worth Avenue, and his achievement as a town maker and a scenographer. And when you look at the compressed vistas and hidden villas and courtyards of Worth Avenue, you see his greatest achievement.
I think that's
looking at it now.
Thank you. That's going to open us up for a great question, I think, later. So Teófilo will take us through some photographs of recent work. Teófilo?
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Liz, for having us this evening. And I do also would like to thank the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art for dedicating an issue to Florida, which seems it surprised us all. In fact, it was somewhat shocking initially. One doesn't necessarily relate one with the other, Florida with classical architecture. On the other hand, what this issue demonstrates very, very clearly is the extent of classical work, which, by the way, we in Florida think of traditional work and vernacular work as very much as part of a classical conception of architecture. But it's true. Referring back a moment ago, when Liz was explaining the trajectory of, or describing the trajectory of classical architecture in time in the state, the fact is that the only time that classical architecture nominally, in practical terms, was not being exercised in the state was really in the 50s, after the war, in the 50s and the 60s, because by the 70s, classical architecture was indeed being exercised in various offices throughout the state. So it is actually quite extraordinary a legacy, a cultural patrimonial legacy of classical and traditional and vernacular architecture in the state. Furthermore, during the 50s and 60s, there was a great deal of work being done by preservation institutions and offices, which kept and maintained this tradition of classicism and craft and the arts, by the way, in place for that period of time. I can only refer to only. Can you go back for a moment, Liz, please, to a very small number of buildings, but nonetheless, I feel that the issue does describe what is characteristic of the work of classical and traditionalists in Florida. And one of them, or the first characteristic that I would like to describe, or rather explain, is the regional character of the work of the classical architect or the traditionalist or the vernacularist in Florida. And so this has been, I think, very much part of the trajectory of classical architecture in time through the history of the state from the very beginning, by the way. San Agustin, one might claim, is a classical town, a Vitruvian town of a kind. But the practice of the Florida architect, in this case the LGV, in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas, for instance, explores the similar sensibilities as they would in their home state. The Palladian influences, for instance, in this particular case in Nassau, have a different, how should I put it, a different dimension when you consider that the codes are different. So the cubic quality of Palladian buildings can be explored in Nassau, while not necessarily in Miami or in other parts of the state. Next slide, please, Liz. And also, yet another characteristic is that in Florida, you will see canonical work, like this work by Ernesto Buch in Indian Creek. In other words, work of classicism that has an academic dimension to it, an academic orientation, which is always affected, certainly, by climate and geography. So there's a courtyard here, a very beautiful courtyard that is reminiscent of the courtyards of Roman courtyards of North African Roman cities, the transom, as you can see on axis of a Cuban palazzo in La Habana. So there's canonical work, but there's also, next slide, please, Liz. There's also a modesty that comes with a assured elegance in this, as an example, in this work by Gil Schaefer of a New England, but really more the hung windows, the shutters of a transatlantic culture in the midst of palms. So the qualities of a New England sober, disciplined tradition are softened in a way, reconsidered by the landscape, which is ever present in the work of classicists in Florida. Next slide, Liz, please. And this a third characteristic of Floridian classical traditionalism, vernacularist architecture, is the willingness to incorporate the canons, in this particular case, in terms of the massing, the proportions of the building, the symmetry, with elements of the vernacular. The transom, for instance, in the window, the blind shutters, and the open shutter gallery in the second floor. This is a work in the Panhandle, and we'll see another work from the Panhandle a little further along by Eric Vogt and Marianne Curry. So the vernacular is ever present, the vernacular that is innovated and invented, but also, next slide, please. A vernacular, or perhaps better described as a tradition that places us or links us to the American South. And as with the New England example by Gil Schaefer, the American South finds its place in Florida. And one might argue that it's been here all along. And in the end, Key West is a New England town. You know, it's very similar to the Loyalist towns that you find in the Bahamas. But there is this type of architecture too, which is a kind of transformed or revised Palladian architecture in the New World, a classical architecture in the wilderness. It can be described in such terms. Next one, please, Liz. And this willingness, I think, to understand classicism as stemming from a comprehension or response, rather, to geography and climate is very much in evidence in the practice of the classical architecture. I mean, in this work of Merrill, Passer, and Colgan, I'm not sure whether this is classical architecture or not. I'm certain, though, that they would very readily make the claim that it is indeed. And the reason why I think that they would argue this is not because the canons are present in the work, but rather because of this profound relationship to the landscape. One more, please, Liz. And lastly, our classical architecture in Florida is not limited to the residential programs or even the commercial program, but it's also very much part of or very much able to convey a civic consideration for the building of the city. So in buildings like this church in Tampa by Duncan Stroy, who's a professor of architecture in Notre Dame, and the following slide is the Tuscan facade of Jorge Hernandez for the Fuel Gallery at the Museum of Coral Gables are civic instances that stem from an architectural practice that, because of its nature and because of its ideological makeup, is able with ease and readily to contribute to the building of the city. if you go onto the next slide, maybe I can make a reference to the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. And I'd like to make this point. Sorry about that. Without that, we'd be lost, or I'd be lost. But I wanted to say one last thing, and it is that this journal, edited by Liz and with so many contributors, has inspired us actually at the chapter to do precisely what is called for. We think what the message is from the journal, and it is to dedicate our efforts to provide a service to the state in documenting classical, traditional, and vernacular architecture, and to do it in a systematic manner, and for it to continue in years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Teófilo. So I hope this was interesting to you all beyond the photos. Christina, I think we could leave the slideshow, if you don't mind, and head into...
You just need to turn it off, and then you'll be back on the screen.
Okay, end show.
That's it.
Thank you. I didn't know I had the power to do that. Are we on? No.
Nope, not yet.
I have to turn it off. How should we do that? No.
I can try.
There we go.
You go. Hey, there you go.
Everybody has a different kind of software. Anyway, thank you, Beth. Thank you, Teófilo. I hope we've given you a kind of overview to what exists in the book, only a taste of what exists in the state, and wonderful news that there's an organization that will continue promoting the research and the practice. So the floor is open, I think.
Well, yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you for this invitation to support the event. It's a real privilege to be here speaking to you about this really wonderful, wonderful issue of the classicists. So many fascinating insights into Florida architecture, urbanism, both from a historical reflective, but just thinking about all the opportunities and challenges going forward, many lessons here that we can apply in our practice. So there's an opportunity now for everybody to join in a little bit. We have a little bit of time to ask some questions. And maybe I'll just start off with a thought that I had, which was simply that when you're in Florida and you're visiting or you live here, you just forget that there's so many good examples of classical architecture here. I was wondering that when you were preparing this publication and the articles within it, whether there was anything that surprised you yourselves or something new that you thought was interesting that you didn't know about before with all your experience in this field.
Well, unlike Beth, who made a full historical tour of the state over her years, which she described, I haven't been to some of these places and had never seen some of these buildings. So actually hearing them described and seeing them in the folio was really a wonderful treat, as I hope it will be for people who take this book home. And it might even be a good way to, when you travel through the state, to decide what you want to visit.
We've got a question here from Joyce Nelson, and she was quick to get this question in, so let's get straight to it. What do you think of the white boxes being built within the historic Coconut Grove?
Not just Coconut Grove.
Right.
I live across the street from something I call the Range Rover showroom, and because I mean, it's 2 drivers and 6 cars and a paved over driveway, but I think that Well, what I basically, the answer is not much, but one of the things I think about when I think about what people are building now and comparing it to what Meisner did is the house across the street from me, which has nothing to show for it. It's like a 10,000 square foot, 6-room house. It took 4.5 years to build, and Meisner built these masterpieces in 6 to 9 months. And I really don't get that. But secondly, I think those very people who are living in those houses, and I think of this with some irony, are the first people in front of the television on Sunday night turning on Masterpiece Theater so that they can look at these beautiful British houses. At the same time, half of them have torn down either something quaint and small in the Groves case, or something rather much more elaborate and from what I think of as the era of gracious living, and a house with rooms and ornament and proportion and windows and light, and it makes me very sad. But I think they're the product of lazy hands and lazy minds too, because it doesn't take that much to draw a straight line on a computer. Although I'm not an architect, so maybe it takes more, but.
I think actually that many of these homes, with all due respect, by the way, come from Latin America, actually, from South America. And I'm from South America, so I can say this. But in Latin America, there's an absolute and complete absence of classical architecture. I mean, absolute. And therefore, I think there's a familiarity amongst these clientele for this type of building. And so, you can see whole neighborhoods in Bogota. It's not the only type of architecture, by the way. There are other directions of modern architecture that have a different relationship to the environment, for instance, as a thematic, as a narrative. But this type of international style, the steel architecture, is prevalent throughout Latin America, and I think that there's a clientele that feels, familiar with this. That this is close to their hearts from the point of view of material culture and so on. So I don't say this in an attempt to belittle anyone or any place really, but I myself have wondered why these things are, built, and why they're so common, and why are people endeared to them, because they are.
I think that's one part of the explanation, and there's another part that, one, we have failed to educate our population in terms of aesthetics. We failed to teach them about how to look at a building, and yet what for art form, if you want to call architecture an art form, what craft, what form of creative expression affects our daily lives more, and yet. Nobody really. I mean, on my street, the houses do not come from South America, and they're attracting CEOs and hedge fund managers who think they're just living in the lap of luxury because they have, 4,000 square foot living rooms that look like airport concourses. But so, it comes from a whole lot of a lot of sources. Although I do think you're right that there is a kind of Latin American influence here.
Mm-hmm. Actually, we have two related questions here, thinking about how we go from here into the future, really. But Steve moves on often reflected on what a great publication this is, but it's really a reflective up till now. So he's interested to know what trajectories might it take post-2020. And also Tom mentions he also loves the beautiful old buildings, but he says, how can architects in the public stay interested in a tradition that is so worked over and so uncontemporary? So thinking about the future a little bit.
Well, I think that this is what I meant to say towards the end, and it is that the journal has truly inspired us to dedicate more time and a greater effort in documenting what we have, because we have extraordinary things, and not just in buildings, by the way, but in gardens and in urbanism. and as well as in craftsmanship. That's one thing that I could say. It might be modest, but it's one thing, one way that I could respond to Steve, and I'm sure he would appreciate it at this. It's not that there isn't, by the way, any work being done. The work by many University of Miami faculty, for instance, and faculty at UF, to mention just a few, that are dedicated to, on the one hand, preservation, and on the other hand, in gardens and in urbanism. So, but we don't have, and this mentioned this earlier, we don't have enough documentation, I feel, in order to educate, like Beth points out, the general public on what we have and what has been left behind as cultural patrimonial legacy. Palm Beach, for instance, is arguably the most successful real estate venture in the state of Florida, and is, classical traditional town. And this has to be conveyed, in a wider sense, through publication, through documentation initially, and publication, it seems to me.
And Graham, if I might jump in with regard to the future and this concern that maybe it's over, it's been worked over, there's nothing else to do. There's a wonderful amount of invention and cleverness in the new versions, in the ongoing new versions of classicism. It is a language which is a living language. I think people do think by looking to history only that, that's been done. But if you go to some of the new urbanist towns which have a traditional architecture, you will see architects working in the language and trying to respond to changing conditions. I think one of the things we wanted to do was show that it's not just about houses, that commercial buildings and institutional buildings welcome this kind of exploration, and that it's, in a sense, it's scientific because it's building on the knowledge of the predecessor and always looking for a new way forward. And that's one of the, I think, the fascinating aspects that the practitioners sense, and maybe some of their clients, and in some cases patrons as well.
Well, one thing that's really interesting as you go through this, the classicist and this issue, is how aware all these architects and designers that you mentioned were of their surroundings. And they have a lot of influences in terms of architecture and styles, but they were very aware of the climate that they were building in. And when we look to the future here in Florida, we know that climate's such a crucial issue for us. So I was wondering if there was anything, and this is one of the questions picked up, about how we can learn from their examples as we go forward and respond to the climate that we have here in Florida and the way it's changing.
Well, I suppose the climate adaptation teacher should say something about that, but maybe the practitioner would also. One thing to remember is that much of what we showed was built in the teens and 20s, and a little bit later, and it was already a reaction to large changes that were occurring. And World War I was an influence. Certainly the pandemic, the influenza, the Spanish influenza, sent people into the warm climates, just like this pandemic is. And the proliferation of outdoor spaces, courtyards, large banks of windows, porches, arcades, those were all part of seeking to be one with climate and place in response to the kind of negative experiences that people have had. Beth speaks in her article about Meisner's stage set fantasies that welcomed people to a new life. And I think there's always that kind of hope for the future that is embodied in it.
I think also, Graham, the first initially in September of 2019, the storm Dorian, and then of course COVID. It has had an effect, and I think a profound effect, in the way that we see our buildings, particularly our homes, but it's not limited to homes. But for instance, I think that house, or rather, I believe that house across the street from Beth doesn't have a porch. And what we've discovered, and not architects necessarily, but in general, is that there are certain elements that are within the scope of classical and traditional architecture and vernaculars that are responsive to climate in singular and unique ways, in effective ways. For instance, natural ventilation. After a storm, natural ventilation is fundamental for survival even. The pandemic has taught us that the open plan has its limitations, and that particularly in terms of providing a degree of privacy to the inhabitants when they have to live the way that we've lived for the last year or so. And also the sheltered open space, which is the porch, which is a classical element. It's a portico. It's the portico of the classical temple, let's say, to use a clear image. That has proven to be essential after the storm, for sure, and through the pandemic. A place to be outside, to gather in shelter. So these things, I think, our clients are asking for these things, because they've lived through an experience where these things have become, by these things I mean elements, compositional elements, programmatic elements, have become very real.
Great. Nathan Norris focuses a little bit more on Rosemary Beach and Alice Beach, and reflects on the amount of talent that's gone into those two places to create this wonderful urbanism that we know about, but also the feeling and the place. Perhaps, Liz, you just wouldn't mind mentioning, the background to how that was achieved in those two places.
Well, it'd be interesting to have Beth's perspective on this, but I would give a quick kind of background on the fact that, yes, as I think we've all said, there were people keeping the flame alive and building traditional houses one at a time amidst whatever surroundings. And one of the things that the new urbanist towns provided, like Seaside, and certainly the two that Nathan speaks of, was a kind of a welcome home for traditional architecture and the ability to make more than the sum of the parts. In other words, that by putting these, really, some of them are tremendously beautiful individual buildings, all working within a similar language in amidst public spaces that are highly specific to those places in the manner of traditional towns of character. But it was very welcoming to architects and to the clients, to the builders, the individual property owners, to imagine that they might be making something that it would end up being more than just the sum of the parts.
I think Liz is absolutely right. I think both of those, the very names, Alice Beach and Rosemary Beach, make my heart sing, because I think they both are so terrific. I recently had a long talk with Marianne Curry about Alice Beach, and because I was studying the images, and I realized that even though it began with this Bermudan aesthetic, the architects there, particularly because Marianne is of Lebanese descent and grew up largely in Paris, they kind of went rogue, and they added these sort of Moorish and Moroccan elements. And that you'd think, how in the world could this sort of restrained, taut Bermuda architecture and this ebullient sort of expression that you find in, sorry, I'm using my hands on a crowdcast, that's a little silly, but and yet it all works perfectly together because, as Liz pointed out, they always have their eyes on the full composition, and the end result is just amazing. And Rosemary Beach is sort of very different because it's so rugged compared to the others. It's a much compared to Seaside or Watercolor or any of the others, which have a sort of refined aesthetic, and Rosemary Beach is a little bit more like pure vernacular. Although that last image, the Scott Merrill apartment building, or is in Rosemary Beach, I believe, and it shows a kind of level of sophistication and environment. I studied that building a lot because I was on a jury that looked at it as a prospect. I voted for it. That's all I can say, but there's an awards jury, but I think it's a very, very, very intriguing and difficult building, but Rosemary Beach has difficult buildings, and I love that about it. Seaside got 2 or 3, and they still remain in everybody's minds. I mean, Walter Chatham's house, if you look up Walter Chatham, which I had occasion to this week, you'll see Chatham House Seaside as one of the first entries that pops up. So, you know, there's something to be said for taking the rules and then taking them and making them into doing something else with them. And I think in Rosemary Beach, that's happened more than once. But again, always with an eye on the final composition, which is why the plan is so all important. And I think that was true in Palm Beach with Meisner too, because he always understood what the final composition needed to be.
So thinking about that overall composition, it mentions in the opening discussion of the publication that from the 1920s, classical Renaissance was really reserved for the more important civic buildings or the monumental structures, whereas the speed at which commerce and residential was being built really took it more in the informal kind of Mediterranean vernacular. I was wondering if there's some lessons there for us today that about celebrating specific buildings over others.
I think it's important. I mean, maybe call me old-fashioned, but I still think it's important for towns and places to have that sense of hierarchy, where you know where to go. I mean, even if and buildings too. I mean, you need to know where to go, where the front door is, and you need to know where to go to pay your parking ticket, or to go to the city commission, or cash a check. And I don't think we've left that behind, even though I don't know, I cash my checks at the ATM drive-through and deposit my checks on my phone, but still, I wouldn't want the bank not to be there. And I wouldn't want it not to look like a bank.
But it's also not a question of style ultimately. And I think that is what we need to address. It's a question of climate response, for instance. An adaptation to a recognition of geography, of where we are and what affects us. And those, I think there are many ways of responding to these profound questions. And it's perhaps not, it's not an issue of whether it's stylistically or syntactically canonical or not, but rather in the response, in a dutiful response to what matters most. I think we'll find those things that Beth wants, like a front door, a recognition of the meaning of the building, of the inherent meaning of form, for instance. I think it's important. Post offices on strip malls, it's not good enough. We have a courthouse here in the Gables that used to be an old Target, and there's a coffee shop in front of it, across the street. I mean, and it's you're having a coffee, and it's not seldom. In fact, it's all the time, people will ask where the courthouse is because you can't tell. It's not different enough from a target to be able to be recognized as a courthouse, and that's real. This sense of not knowing where you are or not knowing where to go, it's real.
Great.
And by the way, I think Florida does that. If you look at that collection of buildings from the journal, it's a very wide, broad scope of stylistic trends and interests from many different architects coming from many different places. That's true.
So a lot of people and scholars and students even are interested in these topics, the classical architecture. It's easy to have these conversations and discuss them, but we need to have them implemented. So how do we get clients and developers attracted or interested in these things we're talking about tonight?
So, Teófilo, I thought that something like that might be a good question for you, because obviously we all might establish our preferences, whether they are emotional or academic or intellectual, the connection with history, the idea that you're, as a practitioner, you're part of the past and the future, that you're making that bridge by continuing a tradition. And so I think we might understand how architects and designers come to this endeavor, but what about clients? What do you think in your clients, what brings people to commit to the classical work that you do?
Well, there's two things that I like to say. One of them is that Coral Gables, the city of Coral Gables, I think is the only city, maybe Santa Barbara in California, that in fact have a classical code. In the case of Santa Barbara, it's a real code. In the case of, a compulsory. In the case of Coral Gables, it's an incentive code. In other words, if you build using Mediterranean elements, you can increase your FAR, to put it bluntly. And so our studio is in Coral Gables, and we work in Coral Gables. It's not the only place we work, but we work in Coral Gables, and everybody else does, And there's a code that incentivizes classical work, but we don't know how to do it. The architects, we don't know how to do it. Furthermore, the fee structure, we just forgot how to do it because it's not taught. Furthermore, the fee structure is not set up to study Vignola, for instance, and figure out how to meet a beam with an arch, for instance. We don't know how to do it. So what saves us are the clients, in fact, who are after something beautiful and wonderful. And the way that we relate to this desire is not by, arguing for classical architecture as a style, but arguing for a profound, true, and real response to the realities of life, to where we live, to our history, to our future as well. What is it that would make us ultimately, happy and proud to live here? This is truly how we argue for it, as well as a better relationship to the environment. So what kind of window do you have, and what would you want to see outside the window? And a porch I think described as an essential consideration. So what saves us, in my humble, modest opinion, in our critical practice, is our clients who are after these wonderful and beautiful things. Like, who built Seaside? Besides, we're fortunate that Robert Davis found Liz and Andres. But I think that this will in Robert's mind to build something beautiful is what made it possible ultimately. I don't know if that sounds too mythical, but or illusionistic, but that's been our experience.
Oh, that's a great answer. Thanks. I'm enjoying the fact that someone's very interested in Beth's fireplace behind her. So
I answered it in the chat, but I actually there was a typo. My house was designed by Carlos Scheppel, and it's 1937, not 1938. But he grew up in Paris, Texas, and then worked in Houston. And in this house, I've not seen any others quite like it. He invoked a kind of Santa Fe tradition, and so there's a built-in grill in the dining room, and there are concrete timbers sticking out of the, as if they were holding up the house. It's got some really amazing details, and alas, it's too big for me, and I'm eventually leaving it sooner than later, but I've lived in it for almost 40 years, so it's a great house.
Beth brings up something interesting, Graham, which is this kind of continuity of practice and ideas and visual components that is shared in the traditions and in the continuing of traditions. And there's a little bit of hubris in saying, as a designer, I can just do, I'm going to do something that's totally new, nobody's done before, or it doesn't matter what people have done before me.
Mhm.
I think there's a great lesson, especially for our time when there's so much, so many divisions, to be involved in work that can unite the architect, the client, the builders, the contractors who revel. One thing I didn't say was you have to go to the ads in the back of the Classicist to see the beautiful craftsmanship that's being advertised by the people who actually do the pieces of these buildings. And I think you begin to understand that elaborate or modest, it is about carrying on conversations over the years. It's about uniting us with past and with future, and a kind of much more holistic perspective of the built environment. It's not just about the individual effort or the individual position and ideas. It's really, there's plenty of room for individual creativity and innovation. And at the same time, connectivity among people and times, cultures. It's really a wonderful, it's a wonderful context to be in.
Do you feel that your students are interested in this topic, and how do you persuade them or encourage them to be interested in it?
Teófilo, you want to take that one?
It's come up a few times in the question, so I want to make sure we cover
We
it.
have all kinds of students, and as most schools do. And there are students that are interested in classicism, without question. There are students that are interested in preservation. There are students that are interested in urbanism. And there are students that are interested in the culture of the avant-garde, in the traditions of the avant-garde, as I've heard it explained. So I don't think that there's one answer in schools of architecture for what architecture should be, particularly in our world today where ideology has disappeared. When we were growing up, when we were students, an ideological discourse within the discipline of architecture was very real, and it was extraordinary, actually. And it coexisted. The postmodernism and rationalism, to name a few, coexisted with deconstruction, to give an example. But today, those ideological stances are no longer, or at least I don't see them, or I don't see them. And therefore the student is much freer, much more open to all kinds of architectures. You can't claim that classicism is the only way. Some people would make that claim, certainly, but not all students would necessarily understand that or accept that. But you can make that claim for anything else. So a student, I think, is able to see today architecture in more profound ways, beyond style, let's say. And I think that climate, if I may say so, because I'm sure you've heard this many times, but I think a profound response to climate and to our world today in this new generation of students is very real. And they're going to be looking at architecture, or they're looking at architecture not just, from the point of view of artistic expression, perhaps, or even innovation as a virtue, but rather in how it really addresses questions of society, of equity, of social justice, of climate, of profound questions. So I'm very optimistic on these new generations of architects and students of architecture. I think that this generation of kids, by the way, and I think I can say this because I have experience, is a wonderful, full of virtue generation that will bring us, I think, many good things. And that I think that architecture is going to be part of this, I feel.
That's a nice answer, thanks. Beth, there was one quote that jumped out at us when we were looking through your article. And you mentioned, or you described Meisner's buildings as stage steps for a new life. And you draw a connection to the new urbanism. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think that's Liz talked about that a little bit when she talked about people coming to Florida to reinvent themselves. But I think that, I mentioned the kind of scenography that went into Worth Avenue, but I think that also is true. And if you happen to buy my Addison Meisner book and look at Stephen Brooks' amazing photographs there, and sometimes he'll have photographs of one room taken from 3 different angles, and you see them as, I think he always seemed to have a vision of how Mrs. Stokesbury would walk through the room, or how someone would descend a staircase, and these were people who had, came out of a more rugged background, like Edward Shearson. I researched every owner, which was another great perk of having so much available on the internet. But Edward Shearson grew up in a little tiny Ontario town, and came from nothing and went on to found one of the great brokerage houses in New York. And so, all along the way, he was creating this ever grander life. And I think for the previous generation, Newport was the culmination of that. When you start following the trajectory of where the great houses were for the America's rich, they first were on the Hudson Valley, the Livingstons and the so-and-sos, and then they moved to Long Island, and then the next, but those houses were paled in comparison to Newport. And Palm Beach's houses really pale in many ways, because many of those are real palaces, and these are winter residences in a way. But they were winter residences where you would have a life that you could only have dreamed of. Somebody, the Duchess of Sussex, I guess that's what Meghan Markle just gave up, actually, but the Duchess of whatever, having a high tea with somebody, and the newspapers all over the country reported this. I found clippings from Carmel, Indiana, and Boise, Idaho, saying Mrs. So-and-so had a tea for such and such, and the following people were in attendance. America followed this, not in the way we do on the internet, but it was these little newspaper articles about who came to dinner at so-and-so's house. And so you can imagine that the setting of that had to be extremely grand, and Meisner delivered. Ceiling, he'd take a whole ceiling out of a house in Europe and then make a dining room table that fit that room. I don't know if that answered the question, but I think that people come to Florida, still have always come to Florida to create new lives for themselves. But these were people who were expanding on the life they already had, and elevating themselves.
We can't talk about Florida without mentioning Miami's, well, he mentions in this question, Miami Beach's Art Deco district. What are your feelings about that in terms of classical tradition? Does it count?
Of course. Did you ask if it counts?
Yeah, this is the question.
Most definitely it counts. Absolutely it counts. In fact, some of our best examples of classical work is Art Deco work. There's Miami, City of Miami, Miami Beach City Hall, rather, for instance. But countless of buildings. Is, for us at least, studying, or rather beginning our practices here, it was enormously instructive. It was a terrific experience. At the time, it was poor, so it was somewhat dilapidated and in a kind of ruinous state. You know, it had a Rome quality to it, or a Venetian quality to it. But so we could study it more in a more didactic sense, you know, more objectively. But by the way, it also happens to be one of the very first urban historic districts in the country. So, I mean, it is not just Miami Beach, of course, but throughout the state, and you know, in Paris and Rome, it's an architecture that is absolutely classical in conception, in production, even, you know, in terms of serialization, for as an example, and the proportions and symmetry is the answer is yes. I mean, I'm sorry if I intruded with this answer, but to me, the answer is most definitely yes.
Well, and you know, I guess I wasn't intending to talk about what is missing in this volume, but I do think that one of the things we were hoping we'd be able to do is more thoroughly show that transition from the classical into the modern. And Miami Beach is, of course, the one of the richest examples of that, from some of the first buildings, and of course the early Mediterranean buildings. But there's some very interesting transitional buildings, including the post office, which could even be said to be related to something that's called Nordic Classicism, which is a particular interpretation of classicism that took place in the Scandinavian countries about that time. And probably, we imagine they were looking, there was communication going back and forth, books and publications and so on. And so what Teófilo says is absolutely true. And those, many of the designers of the Art Deco buildings of the district were in fact classically trained. And some of them, with a little bit of digging, you'll find designed traditionally classical or orthodox classical buildings early in their careers, as did Mies van der Rohe, you know, the great proponent of glass boxes, has a whole cabinet of drawings that are based on Greek classicism. So there's very much of a connection there, and it's a very interesting transition to examine. Work to be done.
You know, I want to jump in and say that Liz needs not apologize for what isn't in there, because she did an extraordinary job under the most arduous of circumstances. If you could imagine putting together a volume of this nature and this scope in a pandemic, with people scattered across the world and people lulled into their, they're sleeping through half their 12-hour days, and it's, I've learned over the years that nothing's ever the end. This is the beginning, and it really offers us a springboard for looking further and deeper. And I mean, when you say the words classicist and Miami Beach, I immediately think of the Banana Republic building and Lincoln Road, because there was a whole school of what I don't know what it's actually called. I call it WPA Modern, but there's a school that's sort of a flattened Deco-ish classicism. It probably does have a real name, but and I think it is considered to be modern, and the WPA used it the most. But I think that this is it's a remarkable volume in itself, and Liz deserves a great round of applause from all of you in the audience. And we would do it here, but that would be unseemly. And we can look at it as a beginning, as a way to look anew at the treasures we have in Florida and the importance of them, and to go where Teófilo was going, talking about students, is look at them for the lessons that you can learn about front porches and cross ventilation and rooms and relationships and porticos and ornament and just a hierarchy of buildings. There's so many lessons that I think you can take away right away and then begin to extrapolate and apply. And there's always more to learn. And I think all of you out there listening should silently applaud Liz right now, because everybody got thanked except Liz.
I am not going to do it silently. Yay, bravo. Bravo.
So, there are many more people in all those chapters. There are a lot of people who produce that. And I, besides all of the writers and aggregators of photos and the photographers, Stephanie Solomon's editorial work and management, other people at the ICAA, Mimi Bradley, and so on, deserve a lot of credit. And while we're enjoying this evening, they're already on to the Mid-Atlantic volume, which they're working on currently.
Well, this just brings back so many memories for me of being at Books and Books, with a packed house, having all of you there. Now we would be convening into the courtyard, going to do the autographing. So I thank you so much for being with us virtually, for enduring all of the technological, challenges of doing this. But it's so great to see your faces. I hope that I'm going to get to see you in person soon. And I thank all the viewers that have joined us from everywhere. I saw questions from Poland. I saw people everywhere. Just remember, you can buy a copy of this beautiful book from Books and Books by just pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen. And again, congratulations on a beautiful publication. Thank you for launching it at Books and Books. And I wish you, so well with your work, and look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
So thank you, and good night. Yeah. Good night.
Bye-bye.